When it comes to lifting heavy circles, a lot of people seem to be in this absolute fear of hurting themselves and leaving themselves crippled for life. Not gonna lie, I often come across a lot of videos on social media of people tearing a part of their body while lifting, and yeah, I love those videos. And they never put a trigger warning either, so it's like, woohoo, maybe let me know what I'm getting into. I usually need to remind myself, though, that social media is a place that tends to often amplify reality. People who post online usually tend to post things that's going to get them a lot of views or engagement. And this can come in many different ways. It can come in ways where people just post all of their highlights, or it can even come in ways where they post their worst moments, like injuries. Because both of these things tend to usually evoke strong emotions. Like, for example, I constantly see women bench 100 kilos plus on social media, but I don't think I've ever seen a woman come close to benching anything close to that in real life. So, that also makes me wonder, how often do injuries we see on social media really happen? Now, of course, injuries with every sport do happen. That's not up for debate, and it is a risk that anyone who gets into a sport has to accept. However, I seem to notice this trend in society where people treat lifting weights, specifically heavy weights, as a really dangerous sport that needs to be approached with the utmost caution. But what do the facts really say? Well, an article was published on the epidemiology of injuries across weight training sports. In this article, there was a systematic review of 20 epidemiological studies. Based on their findings, for the sport of bodybuilding, there were 0.12 to 0.7 injuries per lifter per year, or 0.21 to 1 injury per 1,000 hours. For powerlifting, there were 0.3 to 0.4 injuries per lifter per year, or 1 to 1.1 injuries per 1,000 hours. In total, it concluded that in strength sports, the overall risk of injury is about 1 to 2 injuries per lifter per year. Now, in comparison, a meta-analysis that looked into the injury rates of professional soccer found that there were approximately 8.1 injuries per 1,000 hours of play. And for running, another meta-analysis that was published found that running-related injury rates ranged from about 2.5 injuries per 1,000 hours in long-distance track and field athletes, and found a maximum of 33 injuries per 1,000 hours in novice runners. And lastly, a study analyzing the NFL found an injury rate of 19.3 injuries per 1,000 hours of play. Now, I would like to mention that these numbers can vary sometimes based on different studies and methodologies. For example, I found another study that had findings of powerlifters getting approximately 1 to 4.4 injuries per 1,000 hours of training. But even with these variable findings, the results are still the same and consistent with the fact that strength training sports have overall much lower rates of injury than any other type of sport. I would like to also mention that these injury rates include everything from minor injuries like a nagging shoulder or wrist pain to full-blown major tears. And it's also important to note that people who don't train properly are included in these findings. So it includes all the lifters who don't warm up well, who ego lift, have improper technique, and don't prioritize recovery strategies. But nevertheless, with all of these people included, the injury rate for strength sports still remains low. Now imagine we lived in a world where everyone took their training seriously and did the proper things to reduce injury risk. It would be interesting to wonder how low the risk really would be then. Alright, so now that we know that strength sports and heavy lifting actually has a pretty low injury risk, let's examine why this is. Well, many other sports, like team sports for example, are much more dynamic and unpredictable. In team sports, you have to quickly run through opponents, do sudden movements, and even have collisions sometimes. Whereas in strength sports, every movement is planned and controlled. You decide when to lift, how to move, and when to stop. I mean, even in a sport like powerlifting, which is all about pushing your body to its limits and testing your 1-rep max, has been proven to be much more safer than any other team sport. Perhaps at face value, powerlifting might look much more dangerous, but think about it, like when you go for your squat max, hopefully you have some spotters or you're using safeties so that you can easily bail out of it. And second of all, unless you are stupid and reckless, you have probably practiced your technique numerous times using lighter weights, and when you go for that max, everything is planned and controlled. You slowly walk out of the rack, get into position, You really brace your core to make sure everything is tight, and then you complete the rep. But when it comes to something like soccer, you can never properly plan for what is to come. Every game is different. You have different opponents and different conditions. I mean, I used to play basketball, and I actually tore my ACL, which, by the way, can be a very common injury in dynamic sports. The way I tore it was also kind of stupid. I mean, I didn't come into contact with anyone or anything. I was just sprinting down the court with the ball in my hand, and I guess I stepped the wrong way, and suddenly, next thing I know, my knee is popped out, then popped back in, and tore my ACL, had to get surgery, and it took me about 9 months to really recover. Woohoo. So if strength training sports really are much safer, then why is it that the average person tends to fear it more than any other sport? Well, it's important to realize that strength sports are actually much more niche than mainstream team sports like soccer and basketball. And I believe that people have a tendency to fear the unknown. The truth is, we're not really used to seeing people lift heavy weights, as the average person today is probably sedentary, they've maybe never gone to a gym in their entire lives, and don't know any of the basic principles of training. However, many people have probably tried some type of team sport in their lives, either when they were kids or at school or later in life as a little hobby. And they probably know a little bit about the basic principles that make up that sport, like learning what the rules are, for example. I mean, my favorite team sport was basketball, but when I was at school, I was pushed to try many different sports, like soccer and even volleyball, which I personally really did not like, but nevertheless, I still got the opportunity to try it. However, I never tried classic strength training until my mom forced me to go to the gym one day when I was like 19. And another reason why people may fear strength training sports is that there seems to be some myth circulating around that is actually based on outdated knowledge. Like my mom keeps telling me that she talks to doctors and they say that if I lift heavy weight, it's really bad for my joints, especially at my age apparently. And personally, I can't believe that there are still doctors that spew this misinformation because it really just sets us back as a society. There are currently so many studies that show that strength training actually strengthens joints, bones, and connective tissues. It can help prevent injuries and actually can be beneficial for people who have things like arthritis. There are many reputable articles that talk about this, and I'll link some down below in the description. Now, when I start talking about this topic, a lot of people like to bring up stuff like, but look at Ronnie Coleman! He's literally crippled and he was lifting so heavy, look at him! And it's like, alright, first of all, Ronnie Coleman was blasting steroids, right? Like, okay, we all know this, right? But what a lot of people may not know is that although steroids allow for rapid muscle growth and strength increase, they do not strengthen your tendons and joints at the same rate, which can actually be very dangerous because on one end, you have this immense capacity of muscle growth and strength, but your connective tissues and joints have not caught up yet, which can be a recipe for disaster. Now, natural lifters will have a much more balanced and steady growth of the two, which will really reduce injury risk. Now, another thing about Ronnie Coleman is, like, the guy was actually crazy, okay? Like, he is the definition of no pain, no gain. Even today, after all the things that has happened to him, if you ask him what his biggest regret in life was, he'll say,
I was getting ready to squat 800 pounds, and I'd never done it before in my life. But I knew I wanted to do 2 reps because I did 2 reps doing the deadlift. So I got up under there. First rep was real light. I'm like, wow, I didn't expect that. So I said, I'm going to go a little bit low on this second rep. Maybe that's going to take something more out of me. So I went a little bit lower on that second rep, and it was still light, but I had 2 in my mind, so I racked it. As soon as I racked it, I like, oh man, I could have got 5. Nice. And till this day, I'm still regretting that because I didn't get that 5.
Now this mindset might work for some, but it's really not healthy. I mean, it clearly worked for his bodybuilding career, but at a huge cost. The average person should know how to train smart. Take breaks and deloads, not to constantly push yourself on every lift all the time without giving yourself lighter days or weeks, and to be vigilant of injuries and work around them instead of making them worse. Ronnie Coleman actually had some serious injuries that he just ignored and pushed through. For example, in 1996, when he was doing a heavy set of squats, he heard a loud pop and severe pain radiating down his leg. Regardless of that, He completed the workout, then went to see a doctor, and the doctors told him that he could continue doing his workouts, but he should avoid doing heavy squats. And you know what the first thing he did was? Heavy squat. And yep, that just made things much more worse. He also revealed that he had a herniated disc for literally a decade, but he continued his intense training without slowing down during this entire period. And this persistence, despite medical advice, contributed to further complications. And these are only some of the injuries he's had. He even admits to having back pain as far back to when he was working out in college. However, at the time, he could mostly ignore it since it only started off as being a problem while he was working out. So yeah, Ronnie Coleman was in this constant cycle of not training properly, getting injured, and then ignoring the injury. Clearly, the problems he has now isn't inherently because he was lifting heavy weights, but because he actually had a really unhealthy training style. I mean, if the problem was actually just the amount of weight he was lifting, then why are there so many powerlifters who started lifting in the 80s and are old now, but they're doing completely fine? I mean, take Ed Coan for example. Ed Coan is often regarded as one of the greatest powerlifters of all time, and he was kind of popping off in the 80s and 90s. Ed Coan is a great example of a legendary powerlifter who lifted extremely heavy weights for decades but did not suffer the same catastrophic injuries as someone like Ronnie Coleman. His experience highlights how smart training and technique can help lifters stay healthier in the long run. In fact, Ed Coan is known for breaking many records and has definitely lifted more than Ronnie Coleman, weighing at a much lower body weight, by the way. Now, it is important to note that Ed Coan was not natural during this time, and he actually competed in many untested federations. In the 80s and 90s, it was actually quite difficult to find natural, high-level elite athletes, because unlike today, untested federations were the mainstream in powerlifting. Despite all of that though, the only major injury he has ever had was getting a hip replacement. And I feel like this could have probably been avoided if he wasn't taking steroids, because the roids allowed him to push past his natural genetic capacity, and without them, his strength would have been limited by his body's natural ability to recover, which in turn would have protected his joints. In fact, there are lifetime natural powerlifters like David Ricks, who have been lifting since the 80s, who, by the way, continue to lift seriously heavy weights and have had never major issues because of training smart and using proper technique. By the way, this is Ed Coan now. He's in his 60s, and I think he's looking pretty good, to be honest. He's even pretty decently buff still. And this is David Ricks, squatting 700 pounds, natural, and in his 60s. So what we can take from all of this information is that the problem isn't inherently lifting heavy weights, but it is not following smart training principles. Therefore, if you want to start lifting heavy weights but you haven't because you've been conditioned to fear it, I would just recommend you to start as soon as possible, because it can be very beneficial for you. And if you already are a lifter like myself, who has been kind of getting freaked out and scared of injuring yourself because of all the videos you see online, just remember that as long as you train properly, the risk will still remain low. So that's it for me. Fool Search out.